Ladies and gentlemen, the art of noise.
About this little art of noise before it fought to split. Or about this little art of noise before it stitched a sequin to gimmick. Or about this little art of noise before it was happy. Or about this little art of noise before it was fed. About this little art of noise, a pop art special event gets so little recognition it could turn into a megalomaniac. A critic writes, "A Philistine is habitually bored and looks for things that won't bore him. An artist finds things boring, but is never bored." Or about this brittle art of noise, the most incomprehensible talk comes from people who have no other use for language but to make themselves understood. This is a story about a pop group. A pop group who was simultaneously the most extraordinary pop group and the most ordinary. They had no central vocalist or songwriter, and they made music using car engines, other non-musical sounds, and mythical banks of cutting-edge samplers worth thousands of pounds each. At first, no one knew who or what the hell they were. They hid behind masks, philosophical essays, and a very British sense of humour. They collaborated with Duane Eddy, Max Headroom, the Ely Cathedral Choir, Paul McCartney, Tom Jones, John Paul Gaultier, John Hurt, and Rakim. In terms of electronic music, they were quietly as influential as Kraftwerk, Detroit Techno, or the Yellow Magic Orchestra, and they came to summarise and epitomise all the sonic quirks we associate with music recordings of the 1980s, both good and bad. They were even the first sign of a new musical postmodernism where, to quote Goethe, who was but one conceptual influence, refashioning the fashioned lest it stiffen into iron would be work of endless vital activity. Their music was based heavily on samples, yet eventually they themselves would become one of the most sampled bands ever. This is a story about the art of noise. Who sound like this?
Spanner in the works.
No, stop messing about. Pin back your luggos, because it's the art of noise.
Hey, they're the art of noise. People say they donkey around, but they're too busy talking to Bing Crosby.
From my personal perspective, I wasn't alive when The Art of Noise produced or released any of their music. I was born a couple of years too late for their last record, so it was while I was a student in the early 2020s, doing a course on music technology, that our lecturer played us the first Art of Noise single to make the top 10, 1984's Close to the Edit, as an example of music produced using the iconic Fairlight CMI sampler. More on this in a moment. At this point, my main music of choice was already strange pop songs made using electronic equipment, stuff like The Orb, Daft Punk, The Careless, and I'd also been obsessed with the graphic design meets philosophy aesthetic of people like the Designers Republic as a teen. Watching the surrealist video of anonymous men in suits breaking up pianos and cellos, painstakingly edited to be in time with the beat, and accompanied by these odd sounds like a dum 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 and tra la la. It became obvious to me where all these groups, whose music I'd enjoyed in my youth, had gotten at least some of their ideas from. I was instantly hooked, and could quickly overlook the dated 80s-ness of some of the sound samples, like the orchestral hits. Ever since, I've loved The Art of Noise and their eccentricities, not just in the music, but also in their artwork, their sleeve notes, their ideas on what art and pop music can and should be. They dare to fire intellectual and conceptual ideas at the mainstream masses, but their music, while at times sounding like nothing before or since, is also incredibly fun. There was a sense of humour in how they challenged the pop music of the day, confronting the buying public with in-depth essays and publicity photos that didn't feature any of the band members clearly. Instead, nearly 20 years before Daft Punk became famous for masquerading as robots, the Art of Noise would be portrayed on television as something like court jesters or circus performers. Their artwork juxtaposed colourful commedia dell'arte masks with religious sculptures. This is comedy, but it's also serious. The band story that follows is everything and nothing. It is tragedy, farce, and the most ordinary band profile you've ever heard all at once. There won't be that much drama. The Art of Noise are, after all, grown-ups and British. The traditional American rock and roll story of cocaine in swimming pools was never their way of doing things. But it's still an interesting story of theorising, bickering, having a laugh, and showing what can be done. It's a story about both the connection and the divide between music and technology, which also serves as a metaphor of either the connect or disconnect between the sensibilities of pop and the avant-garde. Crucially, the discography of The Art of Noise is confusing and difficult to sort out, partly due to the release schedules of the 1980s, and partly due to the whim of The Art of Noise's first record label, who are as every bit crucial as part of the story as the music or the band itself, and who revelled in confusing and bombarding people. If you look at The Art of Noise's Spotify profile, you may be forgiven for a bit of head scratching. There's albums, singles, EPs, remixes, compilations, some of which are 3 hours in length, some of which are recent archival reimaginings of singles that would have been released back in the day, and there's also tracks with original titles that turn out to be demos or remixes of other tracks. Lots of them. Searching and head scratching to try and work out exactly where the hell everything fit is part and parcel of the fun of being an Art of Noise fan. Hell, there's not even a clear consensus on whether the band name should be The Art of Noise or just plain old Art of Noise. But as a fan of both the noise and the trend of deep discography dive videos from other more professional music critics on YouTube, I wanted there to be a video that tries to put the history and discography of Art of Noise into some sense and order. A video that would hopefully be a fun new analysis for long-term fans to digest and fall in love with the music all over again, but crucially be an easy introduction for the newcomers, people who've heard one Art of Noise song or maybe none of them. People who delight in new musical and historical discoveries, people who may be finding it difficult to know exactly where to start with such a complicated discography. I wanted to analyse the music properly, find out why it works and why I love this band so much. And ideally I wanted this video to reflect some of the Dadaist aesthetic, bizarre slogans, English eccentricity that for me makes The Art of Noise so compelling. As such a video hasn't yet been made and slammed up on YouTube, I thought I should probably make it myself, and I hope I've succeeded in all of these objectives. The Art of Noise have only just begun.
Okay, Doors, swing.
The Art of Noise are perfectly capable of intelligent conversation. Anything in oil on a flat surface holds their attention. War to them is a form of dancing. They like to hunt hazelnuts and arrange buttons, and they never learn to speak French properly. Our story begins in London and the early 1980s. 70 years beforehand, H.G. Wells said of the city, "The richest town in the world, the biggest port, the greatest manufacturing town, the imperial city, the centre of civilization, the heart of the world. It's a wonderful place." 70 years is a long time. 70 years later, Trevor Horn has already spent a few years in the capital, making music in various capacities, producing and performing with bands such as Track and Yes. In September 1979, Horn shot to fame as one half of the Buggles with the #1 hit, Video Killed the Radio Star. Throughout this video we'll be alluding to similar hits that individual members of The Art of Noise have been involved in. You may even recognise some of them. By 1980, Horn had married music executive Jill Sinclair, who encouraged him to focus on being a producer. He built up a studio with the latest cutting-edge equipment and happened to be in the right place at the right time because this equipment would, in a few years, completely change the sound of recorded music. This was the start of the digital age, and there were countless new drum machines, sequencers, affordable synthesizers, and, most exciting and notable of all, samplers. Horn purchased a Fairlight CMI, a brand new digital synthesizer with game-changing sampling capabilities. At the time, it was one of only 4 in the United Kingdom and cost Horn about £18,000. In today's money, that would be around 77 grand. The Fairlight was expensive because it was so cutting edge. It was the first synthesizer with a built-in sampler that allowed you to record any sound and play it back on a keyboard, allowing you to alter the sound and reproduce it at different pitches.
Nothing yet. Let's see if we've got the noise first. And now I'll speak into the mic. Hello! And we have to wait a couple of seconds now for the sound wave to come up. There it is. Hello. 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 Hello, dear. Hello.
Now music could sound like anything, and the possibilities of what you could make in the studio were a bit more varied than, say, the usual passé rock guitar sound or a rudimentary synthesizer patch on the Mini Moog. You could get melody and harmony out of human speech, or everyday sounds that previously could never have been seen as musical material. It gave greater room to produce pop singles that could really stand out from the crowd and not be replicated or ripped off. At least, that was the theory. As we'll see later on, it didn't quite work out that way, but that's a long way down the road. Anyway, the Fairlight CMI was also a hit at the time with other high-profile musicians of the day, from Kate Bush to Peter Gabriel, but they were mostly using its sampling capabilities as icing on the cake, slapping sound effects on top of whatever compositions they were already working on. As the Fairlight became an important part of Trevor Horn's production arsenal, not surprising really given how much it cost, you'd want to get your money's worth too if you'd spent 18 grand, Horn started to wonder about the possibility of generating new compositions from scratch using the Fairlight. In 1982, he produced some of the best-selling records of that year, the Dollar album by Dollar, and The Lexicon of Love by ABC. By this point, he'd already recruited, amongst others, 3 people to join his production team. Anne Dudley, who'd been classically trained at the Royal College of Music and King's College, before a chance meeting with Trevor Horn led her to start doing session work, playing keyboards and writing orchestral and string arrangements for various artists. ABC's The Lexicon of Love was the first major hit album that Dudley was involved in. She's since worked with Wham, Paul McCartney, Pulp, Robbie Williams, Phil Collins, Will Young, the list goes on and on. Then there was JJ Yenchalik. In the late 70s, Yenchalik roadied for the band Landscape, with aspirations of becoming a drummer himself, only to be told by Landscape's own drummer, Richard James Burgess, that he should learn to type, as computing would eventually be more lucrative. Then Yenchalik met the Buggles. While roadieing for Trevor Horn and his musical partner Geoff Downes, JJ used his gained computing skills to become acquainted with Downes' Fairlight model, helping him out with his technical issues. He then started working for Downes, programming the Fairlight for him, before becoming a freelance Fairlight programmer. You can hear his work on the Kate Bush single Sat in Your Lap from 1981. After joining Horn and Downes on a 3-month American tour when they were playing as part of Yes, Yenchalik was brought on board by Horn to program his Fairlight.
You can do anything with sound?
Yes, we can do anything with sound.
We can do anything. We can do anything.
With sound.
Yes.
Finally, studio engineer Gary Langham, who'd been working in recording studios since he was 18, but had already been assistant engineer on multiple Queen records, including Bohemian Rhapsody, which he later said was a thrill to witness being created in the studio in front of him. He mainly worked at the Psalm West recording studio, which was owned by John Sinclair, Trevor Horn's brother-in-law. His experience and family relation made him an obvious choice for an engineer to join what became informally known as The Team. ABC's Lexicon of Love album was the first time these 4 individuals worked together, and they used the Fairlight heavily on this recording as they started to work out exactly what could be done with it. They were then equally inspired by their experiences working with Sex Pistols manager and music production rule breaker Malcolm McLaren on his album Duck Rock, then working on the Yes album 90125 in 1983. The song Owner of a Lonely Heart in particular can be seen as a sign of what's to come, featuring as it does a few samples, both literally and figuratively, of what would become the Art of Noise Noise. In between the sessions for these two albums, JJ and Gary would experiment further. One Friday night, after a session for the latter Yes album, Gary announced to JJ that he'd had an idea, involving a recording of a drum riff played with gusto by Yes's Alan White, which Trevor Horn had scrapped and ordered Gary to erase. Instead, Gary wondered what would happen if the whole drum riff was loaded into the Fairlight and cut up into a sequence. Nowadays, most drum and bass music relies on this technique of cutting up and replaying individual drum parts just with the rhythm sped up, but in early 1983, no one had really ever thought of doing this before. Despite being anxious to get home, JJ reluctantly agreed to help Gary work the Fairlight. The massive and cavernous sound of the original drum recording on its own already made a refreshing change from all the tinny drum machine sounds that had just saturated the music market. But then when it was put into the Fairlight, which only had enough memory for 2-second samples, the grainy 8-bit compression made the drum sound even more unusual. The drums became the basis of the very first Art of Noise song, Beatbox, which you've just heard in demo form. Eventually, Gary and JJ took the experiment further by throwing other sound samples on top that they'd accumulated from other sessions, including bits of a tennis match, the orchestral stab that was also used on Owner of a Lonely Heart, and a solo, played not using guitars or conventional keyboards, but car engines. Cantata for VW Starter, as Gary Langan originally nicknamed the track. All the elements sounded musical, while not being harmonic in the conventional sense of a pop song. When Trevor Horn learnt of these studio experiments and heard Gary's demo tape for the first time, he couldn't contain his excitement about what he'd heard. And Gary had inadvertently presented this tape at exactly the right moment. Because by 1983, with the Buggles having disbanded, Trevor Horn was looking for a new group to be involved in. He was also looking to become a full-time producer, as per his wife's advice, and start up a record label with her. Now he had some music with which to start this label, which was going to be distributed by the then established Island Records. When Island Records boss Chris Blackwell heard the tape, he was equally enthusiastic, recognising what he called the urban potential of the piece. Having tested the track in a New York club to a rapturous reception, he then told Trevor that this should be the first release on his new label. Enter the man who would become the fifth member of the Art of Noise, and arguably the black sheep, the round peg, the wild card who set the band even further apart from their contemporaries.
What's your role? It's very abstract. I think I do a lot of thinking.
Paul Morley had come to the attention of Trevor Horn and many others in the music industry as an incendiary writer and music critic for the New Musical Express. Morley stood out from other music critics as his lurid, labyrinthian prose owed more to critical theory, academia, and in-depth literature than that of any other music critic. His taste in music was broad and anti-dumb, championing the likes of Joy Division and Public Image Limited, while at the same time developing a fascination for experimental artists such as Brian Eno, John Cage and Steve Reich, who constructed music not with chord sequences, but with instructions and faux scientific formula. They were far removed from the pop and rock scene of the day, so it was unusual for someone who was regularly reviewing and interviewing such acts to also be taking inspiration from more unconventional fields. Despite having previously dismissed Trevor Horn as the dustbin man of pop during the late 70s and the Buggles era, Paul had gradually started to gain more respect for Horn's production style, while in turn Trevor sensed that such a passionate writer and lover of music would make for an interesting record executive. What would happen if you gave such an outspoken music critic the keys to a record label?
I realised that Paul was actually cared about music, and he understood certain things about music. And I thought it would be really interesting if someone like him had the power to actually decide how a record was marketed and what kind of video was done for it. I thought it might prove interesting. I thought all kinds of crazy things might happen. He might upset all sorts of people, and he has.
Trevor brought Paul on board to help co-found the new record label and design its marketing and aesthetic. When deciding a name for the label, Paul Morley took inspiration from the Italian Futurists, whose work and attitude he idolised and felt would be relevant to a music world that needed a kicking, a waking, or perhaps a machine gun taking. One Italian futurist, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, on the eve of the First World War, had written a sound poem in which the sound of a machine gun was written as Zan Tum Tum. And so it was that the new label would be called ZTT Records. Paul then turned his attention to the tapes that would form the basis for the first ZTT release. Again, Paul looked to the Futurists for inspiration to try and put this music into some context and explain its place in musical culture, so it could be seen as something important when it was presented and marketed to people. Incidentally, while at ZTT, Paul Morley would be one of the first people in the music biz to seriously bring ideas from advertising across to the music world. Instead of a poster saying "album out now," you get a t-shirt saying "Frankie say relax," which then becomes a small part of 80s culture, then, now, and forever. So nowadays we're used to albums being promoted like Apple products as some cultish, God-created object with a life force all of their own. When Trevor asked Paul what sense he could make of these tapes, Paul responded by presenting the collective with an 8-page manifesto entitled The Art of Noise Sampling the 20th Century. What became the name for the band was taken from a 1913 manifesto called The Art of Noises by Italian futurist writer Luigi Russolo. At the time that he was performing what some see as the first concerts where experimental noise was presented as music, Russolo wrote that traditional music was starting to become passé and constrictive. Musical sound is too limited in its variety of timbres. Break out of this limited circle of sound and conquer the infinite variety of noise sounds. To quote Wikipedia, Russolo claims that music has reached a point that no longer has the power to excite or inspire. Even when it's new, he argues, it still sounds old and familiar, leaving the audience waiting for the extraordinary sensation that never comes. He urges musicians to explore the city with ears more sensitive than eyes, listening to the wide array of noises that are often taken for granted, yet potentially musical in nature. He feels this noise music can be given pitch and regulated harmonically while still preserving irregularity and character, even if it requires assigning multiple pitches to certain noises. The variety of noises is infinite. If today, when we have perhaps 1,000 different machines, we can distinguish 1,000 different noises, tomorrow, as new machines multiply, we will be able to distinguish 10, 20, or 30,000 different noises, not merely in a simply imitative way, but to combine them according to our imagination. Given that Russolo's noise machines had been destroyed in the Second World War, but that he had seemingly predicted the Fairlight and modern studio technology 70 years ahead of time, it felt appropriate to finish the work he had started. J.J. Jancalek responded to Paul's proposed name of Art of Noises by suggesting they drop the end plural. And so it came to pass that Art of Noise would be Art of Noise. In addition, Paul was influenced by existing sound art in colleges from the likes of Negativland and told the other 4 individuals that the music should give the impression that it was commenting on itself and whatever was happening to it. To quote the sleeve of what would be the Art of Noise's 3rd album in 1987, Ars est celere artem. Stop laughing, it's Latin. It literally means the art is to conceal art. The music, Morley argued, should become a legend, thriving on myths and illusion. In the same way that George Martin, Malcolm McLaren and Andrew Luke Oldham had become mouthpieces, spokespeople or puppeteers for the likes of the Beatles, Sex Pistols and Rolling Stones respectively, Morley would become Art of Noise's self-appointed Minister of Information, writing sleeve notes and giving interviews on behalf of a band that would ultimately remain anonymous, so as to preserve the illusion of music as an amorphous force that materialised out of nowhere, or at least wasn't manufactured by humans in the usual way. A lot of these ideas, while familiar to Paul as a fan of people like Stockhausen, confused the other members, but all the records that Art of Noise ultimately put out on ZTT over the next couple of years are telling in that they don't feature any pictures of the band, which at the time was a bold move. Instead, the Art of Noise would be represented on the back cover of their first release by, of all things, a spanner.
What would the Art of Noise look like? And it was obvious to us what they would look like. They would look like a spanner. Because a spanner is intrinsically more interesting than the lead singer of Tears for Fears.
In all seriousness, I feel this was probably another deliberate tip of the hat to Russolo and the futurist movement, and their emphasis on industrial sounds being the new folk music of the day, with factory workers the new musicians. While all this was going on, Gary Langan, JJ Yenchalik and Ann Dudley had continued experimenting outside their day jobs, writing and churning out countless Fairlight demos of tracks. Langan and Yenchalik would start things off, providing rhythmic beds, before classically trained Dudley would identify the harmony and come up with chords and melodies where appropriate. Many of these initial demos can be heard on a 2006 compilation called And What Have You Done With My Body, God? Among these are the demos for what would later become hit singles, including the track Moments in Love, which, along with Beatbox, was the centrepiece of the Art of Noise's first release. In the summer of 1983, Horn and Morley, together with engineer Bob Croucher, went through all the tapes and selected and compiled 9 tracks to best introduce the Art of Noise to the world. Then, on the 26th of September 1983, ZTT released its first record, a 26-minute single called Into Battle with the Art of Noise. Or, if you prefer, just plain old Into Battle. Or, if you prefer, not a single, as ZTT originally promoted it, but an EP, which is how Paul Morley described the record at a showcase 2 years later. Or, if you prefer, none of these things. In 2009, Morley later argued that the record was neither an album, nor a single, nor an EP, just a length of music that we put on a 12-inch record. At one point, ZTT would claim in their marketing spiel that the business lies in the puzzle, not the explanation. Over the next few years, the label would take playing with formats to a whole new level, confusing and frustrating record buyers with multiple variants of every release they put out. To prolong the life of a single, they churn out endless remixes and 12-inch singles of the same track that would then chart as separate releases. Some of these will be discussed later. In the process, ZTT pioneered one of the defining aspects of how pop music was presented in the 1980s. By the mid-1980s, it was all about the 12-inch, where a 3-minute pop song would be deconstructed and put back together as an epic 10-plus minute journey through the rabbit hole to Wonderland. Into Battle, a 26-minute single that maybe wasn't a single, was the first sign of ZTT playing with formats, and the length of this single, combined with the label's multiple chart-topping reissues of Frankie Goes to Hollywood singles the following year, Relax is just a couple of months away at this point, led to the chart regulators tightening the rules on how long 12-inch records and singles could be. But back to the music itself. The Into Battle EP naturally featured Beatbox as the centrepiece of the first side, and sandwiched this track between playful remixes that sampled urgent orchestras, the Andrews Sisters and Donna Summer, and successfully juxtaposed drama and humour. The second side of the record was a similar story, with the closing vignettes of Bright Noise, which was just 6 seconds long, Flesh in Armour and Comes and Goes, some of the most atonal and unsettling pieces that the Art of Noise ever recorded, being surrounded by a sharply different affair, a 10-minute soothing quasi-lullaby. A composition that had been recorded with the intention of writing the dullest, most anonymous piece of music ever created, but one that then snowballed out of control to become one of the Art of Noise's most popular and enduring pieces by total contrast. Moments in Love. Paul Morley, having come up with the title, promoted it grandiosely as the sex song of the 20th century. I personally don't interpret it as a song about intimacy or sex. For me, it's got more of a Blade Runner vibe, dystopian landscapes, futuristic but devoid of much soul. It also feels like being separated from something or someone of great importance, like fleeting memories of a lost love, moments in love. It's all in a minor key, especially the yearning bridge around the 5 or 6 minute mark, not the major key tonality that you might use if writing something positive or happy like a sex song. The feeling of nostalgia or distance is also aided by lots of large, hazy reverbs used to hide the short length of the Fairlight samples so they didn't cut off too abruptly. But hey, it must be a love song as it's been featured on virtually millions of 80s love song compilations, and Madonna famously had it played as she walked down the wedding aisle to Sean Penn in the 80s, so what the hell do I know? Whatever, the original 10-minute version of Moments in Love, shortened down to 5 for the cassette version, provided Into Battle with a necessary melodic clout, and a contrast to beatbox that showed the talent and potential of The Art of Noise. Its obvious quality shattered any speculation that this was mere studio tomfoolery or messing around with drums. Art of Noise was serious musicians worth watching, and knew from their prior experience working with lots of talented artists like Queen, Yes and Malcolm McLaren exactly how to put a good song together. As debut releases go, Into Battle does a brilliant job of setting out the stall, and remains one of the most vital and powerful opening statements of intent released by any band. And what of its success with record buyers of the day? When Into Battle was finally released on cassette in early 1984, it was updated with new liner notes, commenting wryly on the impact of the original 12-inch in Britain. A nation paralysed by worry and dumb with apathy took one look at Into Battle and didn't know whether to get emotional, get embarrassed, or blurt out rude criticism. Some critics swallowed it, and some spat it out. The New Musical Express decided that Into Battle proved that nothing need fall outside the popular imagination, that everything is possible. Record Mirror wondered what the point of it all was. Melody Maker suggested that here was inconsequential tampering with noise for the sake of it, that it was nothing. Sounds magazine thought that it contained some of the most compulsive music released commercially for years. The Face considered it self-consciously modern and believed that they could make the noise in their own home. The Capitals magazines thought it weird, sublime, ridiculous and startling. They couldn't begin to explain its power. Art of Noise concluded that all critics have large thumbs and disappeared to prepare their next record. Meanwhile, letters flooded into the Zan Tum Tum record company building from all over Europe, congratulating the group on producing something so ribald, thoughtful and happy. Art of Noise looked around them and thought, well, that's life. They were almost right.
And we put out this record called Into Battle, and it made number 2 in a dance chart in Seattle. Unfortunately, to make number 2 in a dance chart in Seattle means 23 people know what you're doing. Whereas if you're the lead singer of Tears for Fears, 74 million people in Egypt alone know what you're doing.
Given how well beatbox had gone down when tested by Ireland's Chris Blackwell in that aforementioned New York club, it's perhaps unsurprising that the United States was where the battle was truly won. By February 1984, the record had hit number 1 on the dance charts, with beatbox also performing well as an individual single. The decision to shroud the band in anonymity led to an embarrassing situation, however, as the music was so perfectly suited to the urban scene that it was wrongly presumed by some to have originated from the black ghettos of Chicago. As a result, not only did a bunch of white musicians get a 12-inch single to peak at number 21 in the US Top Black Albums chart, but later in 1984, that same bunch of white musicians who made up The Art of Noise got told that they'd won an award for being the best black act of the year. When asked to collect the award, The Art of Noise made up some polite excuse. Clearly, a diversion was needed from this mix-up, and The Art of Noise hadn't stopped working in the studio, so in March 1984, just 6 months after Into Battle, Art of Noise released another 12-inch single, Beatbox Diversions 1 and 2. As the name may imply, this is the song Beatbox remixed in two very different ways. Diversion 1 is an 8.5 minute long trip that stays fairly close to the original Beatbox, but with the influence of Anne Dudley becoming more apparent in the new interpretation's greater musicality, and not just because she can be heard at the start of the piece, bemoaning a technical fault with her piano performance having not actually been recorded.
Oh no, I don't believe it.
The original melodies are presented here, but are doubled by vibraphones for that extra fantasia, and combined with new guitar stabs, bass lines, and a middle section with a trumpet solo sounding like something out of Mario Kart. But most surprising of all was how the track ended, with all the synthetic instruments unexpectedly cross-fading into a piano solo performed by Anne Dudley. The precise combination of musicianship and noise tomfoolery wrong-footed everybody, with the piano solo being seen as a highlight by listeners, but it was on the B-side that the Art of Noise really went to town. Diversion 2 was an ever further departure from Beatbox, because while the drums were still there, the tune on top was completely different. A 12-bar blues standard gone haywire with added synth brass, and dum-dum-dums and tra-la-las. Yes, this was the first Art of Noise piece I ever heard, as played to me by my lecturer in that music technology class, and it would later be re-released as a hit single under its better-known title, Close to the Edit. But more on that later. Beatbox Diversions 1 and 2 was again reviewed by the British music press with a mixed bemusement, but did manage to scrape the UK top 50 in April 1984. It was intended to be a more revealing teaser of what would have been the Art of Noise's proper debut album, Worship, which at one point Paul Morley had wanted to call Goose Jazz, as an ode to its spiritual predecessor, Malcolm McLaren's Duck Rock. This draft of the album was looser and more scattershot than the album that most people know. It featured Diversion 1, and a slightly different edit of Diversion 2, which was called Diversion 7, then called Close to the Edit as a nod to Close to the Edge by Yes, which Trevor Horn had produced and then presented to his prodigies Gary, Ann and JJ as a case study in how to do music production, how to structure a song and so on. Then the rest of the album relied on additional diversions of beatbox, short samples from obscure jazz records from the likes of Yasuaki Shimizu and the Saxophonettes, and completely new tracks that debuted here for the first time, such as A Time for Fear, Who's Afraid, a track that took topical inspiration from the American invasion of Grenada to come up with a suitably claustrophobic and bloody track about the violence of war.
Military forces from neighboring Caribbean nations and the United States have arrived in Grenada to protect lives and restore order. Your cooperation will ensure that peace and democracy.
And then the Art of Noise quote the theme tune to the great war satire of the 1980s, MASH, because, well, of course they do. The debut album wasn't initially structured with the charts in mind, but by the summer of 1984, concerns about sample clearance were starting to arise regarding the original Worship draft, and Close to the Edit had unexpectedly shown signs of being a hit single on the US dance charts. And so Horn and Morley decided to restructure the album, cutting a lot of tracks and reinstating Moments in Love from the original Battle EP. Worship with the Art of Noise became Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise, and was gradually rolled out worldwide in the latter half of 1984. This time the critical response was much more positive. To this day it's seen as a quietly influential techno-pop masterpiece, and many Art of Noise fans see it as a career highlight. And sure, if you're new to the band and don't want to start with the Into Battle single, all the essential tracks that most people remember, Diversion 1, Close to the Edit, and Moments in Love, they're all here. You also get some new memorable tracks. The aforementioned Time for Fear makes for a powerful opening track, and the 1-2 punch of closing tracks How to Kill and Realization is equally effective. But personally, when you account for the singles that had already been released, I think I prefer the Worship version, with its greater continuity and more unrestrained weirdness. Worship feels more like an album, whereas Who's Afraid just feels like a scattershot compilation of edited highlights, with only 9 tracks, 4 of which don't exceed the 3-minute mark. By contrast, Worship has 18 tracks, and while a good few are reprises, A Time for Fear effectively gets heard twice. It's just a more fun journey to have the Yasuaki Shimizu jazz record phasing in and out periodically as a narrative linking device on the Fingers of Love tracks on the first side, before finally being heard on a version of A Time for Fear near the end of the album called The Movement of Desire, in a perfect payoff. There's also various tracks that were cut down in length for the final release, but make more sense when heard in full on Worship. The 90-second track Sign of Relief is a lovely track that melodically reminds one of the sort of happy theme tunes the Radiophonic Workshop were doing in the 60s, while its Casio keyboard tones carry a similar lo-fi charm. On Worship it had a beginning, middle and end, but on Who's Afraid the track was renamed Snapshot and ends very abruptly after just a minute, which makes for a different impact. It feels less like a piece of music in its own right and more like a barrel-scraping interlude to pad out the record. In addition, the 5-minute track And What Have You Done With My Body God amuses on Worship, as 2 minutes of ambient footsteps, church bells and thunder noises is counterbalanced by J.S. Bach's St. Matthew Passion being played on a majestic sounding church organ in its entirety. Having been the source of the footsteps, Anne Dudley had wanted to call this tribute to the sound of religion, and did those feat in ancient times. Instead, Morley decided to call the track Memento. And then the joke was lost when the track was heavily edited, with much of the Bach chorale being cut out bar the final refrain. For me, the slow fade in on the Worship album works much more effectively. I may be splitting hairs here, but these are a couple of examples of how I think the final track listing of Who's Afraid might have been a bit overcooked and too reliant on already heard tracks like Beatbox and Moments in Love. Indeed, one criticism thrown at this album when it was first released was that it was a bit of a con if you had already bought all the previous 12 inches, because leaving aside the tracks that had already been released, there was little new here. Had the album retained tracks such as Damn It All from the original draft and not edited down the aforementioned examples such as Sign of Relief, I think it would be more varied and rewarding for everyone. But alas, there were lots of commercial factors at play and the time constraints of the vinyl format to consider. Certain members of Art of Noise did take exception to the tinkering, with Anne Dudley saying a year later that she'd felt parts of Who's Afraid were dodgy. However, the album did do reasonably well with critics and listeners. As an introduction to the Art of Noise, it was and still remains effective and captivating. It was in the UK Albums Chart consistently for 6 months after its release, and was also accompanied by another 12-inch single, whose new material more than made up for the lack of surprise on Who's Afraid. In November 1984, Close to the Edit was released as a single in the UK at the same time as the album also went on sale. While the 7-inch single was relatively faithful to the song, the 12-inch mix was a drastically different kettle of fish, as was the trend back in the 1980s. Close to the Edit became Close Up. The car engine sounds and beatbox drums were hardened up and given a little bit of overdrive, making the song into a harder dance mix that would go down a storm in the clubs but still stand out quirkily from other club records. It also featured another one of Anne Dudley's beautiful trademark piano solos, but the most exciting solo of all was left until the end of the track and was produced not by a guitar, piano, or even any piano keyboard. It was in fact performed by Chris Barry. who these days is best known for his later performance as the anally retentive Rimmer in sci-fi sitcom Red Dwarf. But during the 80s, Chris was an in-demand impressionist of politicians and entertainers, mainly for TV shows like Saturday Live and Spitting Image. ZTT used his vocal talent on quite a few records. He can be heard imitating the then Prince Charles and the then President Reagan on Frankie Goes to Hollywood's first album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, released around the same time as Who's Afraid. Presumably during these same recording sessions, JJ Jančářek, who's credited with software and programming on the Frankie album, got Barry to say, "Who's afraid of the art of noise?" in loads of different voices, before loading them into the Fairlight and screwing them up with all manner of stuttery automated loops.
Who's afraid of the art of noise? Still the art of noise. Still noise. Still the art of noise. Still the art of noise.
Raise the roof for the art of noise!
Against all expectations, Close to the Edit really did become a hit. In December 1984, The Art of Noise were invited onto Channel 4's music programme of the day, The Tube. However, the band's first live television appearance was undermined when plans to have the Masks perform, rather than the actual musicians, were vetoed by the TV producers. The band travelled all the way from London to Newcastle, having only been given 2 days' notice, donned the face paint and leotards, and Paul Morley got into a slightly tense exchange with a very young Jules Holland.
On with the Art of Noise then. What have you got to say about them that would impress us?
Well, at the moment, I like them very much. Doesn't that impress you, Jules?
Do you know how much those Fairlight cost?
Fivepence. That's a very silly question, Jules, in 1984. To ask how much of the technology to make pop music costs. It's a very naive question, in fact.
Well, not if they're about £20,000, because it rather precludes a lot of people using them, doesn't it? Would you ever thought of getting into politics?
Yeah, I would, actually, if I'm up against people like you.
Yeah?
If you ask me a really good question, I could respond in a positive way.
Anyway, our new album is called Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise, and it's available now from all good record shops. That aside, in February 1985, Close to the Edit finally reached the top 30, which meant the inevitable call from that other music programme what was on at the time, Top of the Pops. Unfortunately, their producers were also not keen on the Masks appearing solely on the band's behalf, which led to Anne, Gary and JJ being left with no other option but to mime the song and feel rather stupid doing it. They later expressed relief and gratitude that the studio director decided to obscure most of their bad miming and lip-syncing to voices that they didn't even do originally with clips from one of the Close to the Edit videos. Yes, there are even multiple videos for this song after Polish director Zbigniew Rybczynski's film, involving men in suits beating up old instruments, was deemed by ZTT to be too violent. Paul Morley in particular felt it wasn't representative of the Art of Noise because apparently Art of Noise don't wear thin ties, so he commissioned animators Matt Forrest and Andy Morahan to put together an alternative. Later in February 85, Close to the Edit peaked at number 8 in the charts. It was followed in April of that year by another 12-inch single, Moments in Love. Despite this song being very familiar by this point, the single was a worthwhile release as the 5-minute single edit was supplemented by some lovely reinterpretations. The Beaten remix was a completely new re-recording with extra piano parts and new vocals, and in hindsight was a strong indication of the direction Art of Noise would head in on their first album, which Morley already had a working title for. The Art of Noise are daft as a brush. As for the other mixes, the original backing track was slowed down into a silky smooth lounge jazz number called Love Beat, and Beatbox got another run around the block, with Diversion 1 being shortened down to become Diversion 10. That was the vinyl single. Then the cassette was an exclusive continuous mega mix of all these different pieces, specially titled The Tortoise and the Hare. There was even a very special dinky tortoise-shaped 7-inch picture disc, which as far as I'm concerned is the coolest thing ever. A Time for Fear would have been the next single later in 1985, but that plan was curtailed when Moments in Love failed to make the UK top 50. At the time of its release, no one was to know that it would be the last Art of Noise single on ZTT Records, and that just a few weeks later, what many regard as the imperial golden age of both band and label would come to an abrupt end. Moments in Love was at least the perfect way to end this chapter of Art of Noise. With it having been a major part of Into Battle, the very first Art of Noise release, some 18 months earlier, it was an appropriate closing of the loop. A full circle before things got a bit more chaotic.
Suicide is painless. This is The Art of Noise. What did you expect?
In May 1985, ZTT Records held a series of concerts at the Ambassadors Theatre in Soho, London. The venue of entertainment was essentially a showcase for the label's many and varied acts at that time, with the notable exception of the best-selling act, Frankie Goes to Hollywood. The Art of Noise were advertised at the top of the bill, accompanied by Propaganda, Andrew Poppy and Anne Pigalle, and many people, understandably, went to the event especially to see the Noise.
Well, I came here to be entertained. Well, I came here to hear the Art of Noise.
Oh, I wonder how he felt afterwards. The Art of Noise did sort of appear, but instead of banks of synthesizers operated live by the actual members, as had been the case with previous television appearances, the audience were instead treated, and I use the term very loosely, to dancers and a backing track. Paul Morley then appeared on stage, explaining that this is how the Art of Noise was always supposed to be. No members, because masks and spanners are more interesting, blah blah blah. It was certainly very Art of Noise to defy expectation and audience desire like this, and certainly looked good on camera when the venue of entertainment was eventually released on video. Didn't go down very well in the press reviews, and some theatregoers felt a bit cheated, but the bemusement was of course the whole point whenever Paul Morley was involved.
Well, it didn't go too bad. I remembered my lines.
That said, it wasn't originally the plan to substitute the band for 3 anonymous dancers. Behind the scenes there had been a breakdown in relations between ZTT and the Art of Noise, culminating in Dudley, Jens Charlik and Langen pulling out of the performances at the last possible moment and ultimately leaving ZTT to sign a new deal with China Records. The exact specifics of what went down at the time have never been fully explained by anybody involved, and it's all now water under the bridge. But at the time, it was hinted that the Art of Noise were unhappy with how the publicity for the band, while erasing the 3 principal songwriters and engineers, focused more on Trevor Horn and Paul Morley, the latter of whom would do press interviews on behalf of the band, despite the pair ultimately having little to do directly with the music beyond being record execs. Apparently certain members found Morley's habit of decorating album sleeves with pictures of statues and long essays on how tortoises retreat into their shells as a metaphor for stupidity to all be a bit silly, really. Meanwhile, Trevor Horn was too busy producing other acts to give the Art of Noise any support. At this point, he'd spent 3 months working with Grace Jones and also had commitments with Frankie and Propaganda. The most specific explanation that was ever given came many years later from Jens Charlik, who said in an interview, "It would be fair to say that by then the Art of Noise was a band. It had members. We were writers, we were recording, and so it was an entity, even though it was a bit of a squidgy, sort of amorphous, unusual grouping with no singer, no lead singer. Simply put, we found we were out of contract. Every contract had an option period at the end of it, and it was incumbent upon the rights holder to go, okay, we're extending the option, which they didn't do. So basically when they said, we'll do this show, we sat there and went, anon, we're not contracted to the record company anymore. Things ultimately cooled down between the various parties, but there was a brief war of words in the mid-80s, with Paul Morley telling the press of his disdain at how his rebellious pet project had become the very thing it sought to parody, a conventional rock act. The Art of Noise would merely respond by criticising Morley's bungling attempts at punctuation, but would ultimately prefer to look forward, to focus on the future and on legs. Legs was the first single that Art of Noise put out after the split, and it came out on China Records in October 1985. The first thing you may have noticed if you were an Art of Noise fan and you heard the single for the first time is that the drums are recycled from Beatbox. At the time Art of Noise left ZTT, Morley had been making tentative plans for how to present their second album, including an idea that would take the then remix phenomenon to its logical conclusion. All the tracks would have been, according to Morley, remixes of remixes of remixes of the first album, so remixed they had all become new pieces of music. Perhaps Legs is the only surviving evidence of that idea, perhaps it's nothing to do with it. Whatever the case, Legs definitely takes the drums from beatbox and adds new sunny harmonic and melodic material on top. There's a nice catchy vocal do-do-do-do-do hook, that somehow feels more pop than anything the Art of Noise had done up to that point. Where I think Legs, pun intended, stumbles slightly is that it's not entirely original. It's clearly beatbox too because of the drums, but like most sequels, it's not quite as fresh or compelling as the original beatbox. I think the main issue is in the structure of the song. Beatbox, for all its oddness, actually has quite a sensible A-B verse-chorus structure that's easy to get into, whereas Legs feels more through-composed. You have one section, then another completely different section, and it doesn't really gel together as a cohesive whole. Luckily, B-side Hoops and Mallets, while being even odder, made up for that by being less cluttered, and even today it sounds like an alien's idea of the future in a way that Legs couldn't quite manage. Crucially, although Legs didn't chart as well as the earlier ZTT singles, that's perhaps forgivable for the first release after a massive restructuring, the single did prove, simply by its mere existence, that the Art of Noise was more than just a Zan Tum Tum fantasy in the mind of Morley and Horn, and that it could exist independently. This created a momentum and encouraged China Records to ready their resources so that when the Art of Noise had completed that so-called difficult second album, everybody involved hit the ground running. In April 1986, the Art of Noise released Invisible Silence, their first full album on China Records. It became their most commercially successful album, reaching number 18 in the UK charts, and while I still feel a great attachment to the ZTT era, with its playful aesthetic that could never quite be replicated without Morley, in many ways this is just as good. It was here the band managed most shrewdly to make their sound palatable to a wide audience without selling out, getting the balance of melody, harmony, rhythm and technological innovation just right so that everyone was catered for regardless of their musical tastes. If you desired more of the same, tracks that nostalgically reminded you of the last album, you had the aforementioned single Legs, and there was also Instruments of Darkness, a relentlessly pounding track that satirised South African apartheid in the same way A Time for Fear had done the US invasion of Grenada. In fact, the two pieces were probably too similar. There's even a piano fade out just like Beatbox Diversion 1, but anyway. Some tracks were more experimental, such as Opener Opus 4 or Slip of the Tongue. Some tracks were incredibly bouncy, like the intense rush of the Chameleon's dish, and some were gentle and soothing, like the hypnotic Camilla, which is a personal favourite. The album is probably their best sequenced, especially in the second half, where no two tracks are the same, but everything complements each other. The album also gained attention with memorable collaborations. Legendary Nashville guitarist Wayne Eddy was roped in to help out with a cover of the Peter Gunn theme tune, which worked far better than it had any right to, becoming a favourite of much admired radio DJ John Peel, and even impressing the original composer Henry Mancini, who wrote to the band to give it his blessing. Another bizarre collaboration, this time with haywire computerised video jockey Max Headroom for the single Paranoia, was equally well received. If you're unfamiliar with the story of Max Headroom, I'd recommend checking out Space Feather's excellent YouTube essay on the subject, entitled On Max Headroom, the Most Misunderstood Joke on Television. None of that backstory is evident on the Paranoia single, unfortunately, but what other pop groups in the top 20 would have dared to collaborate with a deranged synthetic parody of the talk show host who, even by Art of Noise's admission to the press at the time, couldn't actually sing?
He's talentless actually, and for that reason is an ideal pop star.
Yes. He's a very poor sense of rhythm.
No sense of melody. Tuning's appalling.
So we thought, oh well, this is the kind of challenge we like.
There were also alternate mixes of Paranoia featuring Max Headroom, as the piece was now known, the extended version and Paranoid mix being well nice and worth investigating. Don't worry, by this point we won't be talking too much about single mixes and 12 inches, as the New World Order of China Records didn't take the medium quite so seriously as an art form compared to ZTT. Indeed, one of China's ad campaigns to promote singles was "The Mixes Stop Here." During the summer of 1986, the band went on a world tour, attempting to prove that such studio-based material could be played entirely live by augmenting their lineup with backing singers, guitarists, percussionists, and drummers playing trigger pads, all very ahead of its time back then.
The show we do and we are seeing is entirely live. It's played by musicians who have the assistance of modern technology in as much as they are able to play the sounds that we recorded. But I must stress, and I will, believe me, that they're all playing live, and when they hit something, although it may not be the drum itself that sounds, they are actually playing each individual thing. So in as much as it is complex, it is straightforward.
We plan to do a tour because of our essentially contrary nature, I think. Because it was the last thing that people thought the Art of Noise would do, a live tour, then that was obviously what we wanted to do.
You can hear an example of the band's live act from this time on the Noise in the City live album, recorded in Tokyo. And there was also a video of a performance at the Hammersmith Odeon, which some kind souls have uploaded on YouTube in high quality. Then, in October 1986, there was one last hurrah for the Beatbox and Legs singles, a new mix entitled Legacy that slowed the beatbox drums down a bit, recited the melody from Legs, and added some new electric piano vibes on top. It was all rather successful, really, and Dudley, JJ Jančárik and Gary Langan, who just months earlier had been sidelined, downplayed and ignored by both their record label and the music press, were finally being recognised for music that was innovative, sexy, provocative, alluring, and whatever word you care to mention other than boring. They managed to remain true to their playful, experimental roots, while at the same time increasing their commercial success. All of which posed a problem if you were ZTT. Trevor Horn and Paul Morley looked on, shaking their heads in disgust as the Art of Noise went from strength to strength, while their own endeavours were, by contrast, flagging. Frankie Goes to Hollywood crashed and burned with their second album, Propaganda were trying to get out of their record contract, the label was losing all its most successful acts. By the end of 1986, ZTT desperately tried to cash in on the success of the Art of Noise, as well as the arrival of a new format called the CD, with a compilation simply titled Daft, which, as you may remember, would have been Morley's working title for the second Art of Noise album had the band stayed with ZTT. Daft was basically Who's Afraid with some extra tracks copied and pasted from various singles. If you're looking for a quick summation of all the ZTT releases, or you only want one Art of Noise CD in your collection, this one will do the job. But what's most notable about this best-of record is the liner notes, which Paul Morley used as a vehicle to vent his frustrations at the split. Writing under the pseudonym Otto Flake, he explained how the Art of Noise was originally a part of a larger 8-year project entitled Raiding the 20th Century, an immodest, insightful assembly of musical drama, ornamental documentary and cultural commentary to illuminate the beauty and brutality of the 20th century and release views, reaction and analysis through that well-known accessible context, rock music. Use interviews, records, literature to communicate in the name of the fullness of life a contrary, suspicious view of the consumer, entertainment, imagination and happiness. Members of Art of Noise who aided on the musical side of Horn and Morley's swindling mediating project have now decided that they are competent enough to pursue a conventional rock career, and that this is something they prefer. The settled patterns of a rock schedule, its unsubtle, manufactured sincerity. Accordingly, they have jettisoned themselves out into the pop area, where meaninglessness is a virtue, agreeing with the rock industry's viewpoint that all unsettling and cross energy must be reduced to purposelessness for the sake of public safety. Members Jančárik, Dudley and Langan, disconcerted by Horn and Morley's subversive attempts to bruise the complacency of the rock industry and prepare a long-term, large-scale project of celebration, interpretation and malice, have retained the name Art of Noise as the commercial success associated with it suits their brazen career-besotted attitude. They will continue Art of Noise as a mainstream pop group, out there amidst the teeming herds, signed to a label well apart from Trevor Horn's and Tum Tum. Horn and Morley viewed their decision with resigned amusement. Art of Noise, once a most joyous, secretive parody of the pop group and what it might be, will be Art of Noise, the pop group, and what it must be. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think ZTT were very happy. Horn and Morley did also try around this time to put together a new band called Art and Act, with Horn's assistant producer Stephen Lipson. It was teased and muted in a few music papers as a continuation of the Raiding the 20th Century project, and was intended to take over from Art of Noise as, in Morley's words, ZTT's house band. In the end, Art and Act only recorded 1 or 2 songs at the end of 1985. This Is Your Life, also known as Life's a Barrel of Laughs, and Yes or No. These sketches form a nice companion piece to what the Art of Noise were doing simultaneously, but with Horn and Morley ultimately focusing on working with other ZTT acts like Frankie and Propaganda, Art and Act was only ever going to be a side project, for which, to quote a small throwaway slogan on the back cover of the Daft compilation, there wasn't time. The few recordings Art and Act did before Horn and Morley lost interest were unreleased until the 21st century. If you want to hear and hypothesize a parallel universe where Art of Noise stayed on ZTT, look up the Life's a Barrel of Laughs EP by Art and Act on digital platforms. Ultimately, the ZTT label fell from grace big time, with most of their high-profile acts taking them to court over unfair contracts, while Art of Noise, ever being ahead of the curve, had got out before the storm, and could look on smugly while their more equitable deal with China Records saw them bounce back gloriously, winning Grammys, scoring soundtrack for films, and writing certified dope theme tunes for otherwise innocuous game shows like The Krypton Factor. Then Gary Langan decided to leave the band and concentrate on producing and engineering other artists. And so came another pivot, one that was much more dramatic musically. While Invisible Silence was a very accomplished and successful pop record for such an unusual group, it could be argued that, with its reliance on melody and those very 80s synth pads, that the music was deviating from the original concept of Luigi Russolo's Manifesto. It was time to bring those noise sounds back into the foreground, and that's what the Art of Noise did with their third album, released in September 1987. In no sense, nonsense. After being demoed by Anne and JJ, the final album had been produced and recorded in just about 8 weeks. That fast turnaround is sometimes apparent in the material, which relies a lot on short vignettes and sketches, but what's also apparent is the greater emphasis on natural sounds, mostly executed via a new element that differentiated this album: field recording. All the tracks are segued together to form one continuous mix of 15 pieces, and in between each track we hear all sorts of random goings on: motorbikes, helicopters, a door creaking shut in the local supermarket, people wandering down corridors, train horns, the baboons at London Zoo, a string orchestra tuning up in preparation to play the piece that follows a couple of tracks later. Even the security guard of the band's recording studio making a cameo appearance, shuffling his keys, then asking Anne and JJ as they head home, "Is this seriously a pop record?"
JJ, what time tomorrow? 11?
Oh yes, 10 to start. As soon as you can.
Is it seriously, I think it's going to count to like a facetious question, but is it seriously for a pop record, the music? I mean,
yes.
Like Worship, it was all a bit meta, with many of these elements being implemented musically into other tracks. Most effective of all were the 3 tracks in the middle of the album: EFL, Ode to Don Jose, and A Day at the Races, which in my mind are some of the strongest tracks that the Art of Noise ever made. A Day at the Races is a particularly striking and funky track, reminiscent of beatbox but rebuilt from the ground up with new drums, and excellent use of sound noises and sounding more industrial. The melodies are constructed using samples of race car engines and commentators, and like the melodies on beatbox, they work because the sample source means they're halfway between music and noise, the sort of natural musical note that no other instrument could produce. and there's an excellent reprise for the intercity trains that open the album and can also be heard to great effect on Ransom in the Sand. Then the main melody of Ode to Don Jose is played back on a sampler using the sounds of the London Zoo baboons, resulting in a piece that again sounds completely alien, but not like anything a synthesizer or any other instrument could replicate. It wasn't always successful. One Earth was a somewhat underwhelming closer that after its initial promising beginning failed to go anywhere with it. Roller 1 will sound terribly dated to modern ears, and the cover of the Dragnet theme, while fun if you're in the right place, was a blatant attempt, mainly by the record company, to recreate the successful formula of Peter Gunn, even down to the main hook being doubled by a pitch-shifted vocal at the end. And of course, these sorts of formulas are never as successful the second time around. In many ways, this album was the peak of The Art of Noise, where their original manifesto and that of Luigi Russolo was most closely met, and in a much more subtle and satisfying way than on previous efforts. It really is an album that only works when you turn it up loud. It does also show signs of how the original concept that defined The Art of Noise, ordinary sounds becoming extraordinary music, was starting to run its course, along with the collaboration between the individual band members, of which there were now just 2 by this album. At this point, in 1987, samplers no longer cost as much as houses, and were starting to become readily available to everyone. We're just a year away from the second summer of love and the birth of acid house rave culture, and this is around the time that hip-hop was really starting to take off and become a global phenomenon. A month before the Nonsense album was released, EMU Systems had released the SP1200 sampler, which, along with the following year's Akai MPC-60 and Ensoniq EPS, would become an instrumental component in both dance music and what many people cite as the golden age of hip-hop.
Y'all wanna know how we make the music? We sample. You hear that? That, we put some of that in there, some of that, and then we just...
Sampling was no longer an innovative novelty. The tools were available to more people, so by the late 1980s, more and more music was incorporating samples. But this was a double-edged sword, as rather than sampling unusual real-world sounds to come up with new sounds and pop hooks, new artists were mostly ripping off other people's records, often to try and avoid the harder route of coming up with something new, or distracting the audience with the nostalgic delight of hearing a recognised and beloved musical classic. Soon, Stock, Aitken and Waterman would be dominating the pop scene with hit singles made up entirely of bits from other songs. The market also became oversaturated in a lot of house music, where cool vocal soundbites would be stuttered over and over again.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume. Step with the record, thinking of a master plan.
What does it all mean? What do I want? Everybody gonna scream. Get down to the fucking beat.
Every music analysis video needs some additional reading to sound ultra intellectual, so I'd now like to quote David Stubbs, who, in his excellent book, Mars by 1980, The Story of Electronic Music, probably summed this time up better than I ever could. As sampling spread through pop in the mid-1980s, rather than opening up multiple textual potentialities, it degenerated into a box of tropes and tics and habits. The same stuttering effects, the same incredibly narrow pool of source material, the mid to late 1980s flooded with samplers was in some ways a depressing time. Every "oh yeah" poking out of the middle of a workaday radio song or Max Headroom style stuttering voice lift felt like a testament to laziness and the resigned sense that there was nothing new under the sun. Far from being the contemporary device that would launch 1,000 chance encounters between sewing machines and dissecting tables, the sampler felt like the resort of retrograde scoundrels, the anti-serious, for whom pop music was no longer an innocent effusion, but a postmodern lark, meta and neo, something hung up by inverted commas in two knowing times. It was nothing that mattered anymore. Indeed, it was composed of dead matter. The Art of Noise wanted nothing to do with this new world order, for it was obviously not why they'd started exploring the potential of samplers in the first place. Anne Dudley was particularly appalled by the hijacking of sampling and was beginning to want to move on and do other things musically. She was starting to write Hollywood film scores. 1987 saw the release of her first film, Hiding Out, and the following year she'd be involved in the successful British rom-com Buster, which starred Phil Collins. This new career path and direction can be heard on the oddly named track Debut, which is of course sequenced at track 6, and was written alone by Anne Dudley. This is where the string orchestra properly features, playing a progression that's constantly shifting between 4/4 and 6/8 time signatures. Then the Ely Cathedral Choir were recorded for the track Counterpoint, singing an arrangement of a melody that drove the earlier track, Ode to Don Jose. The emphasis on unaltered classical orchestras would be even stronger on the Art of Noise's next album, which was even more of a reaction against sample culture, but more on that in a moment. The overabundance of sampling in the wider world meant that this album, In No Sense Nonsense, never quite got the respect it deserved. The Art of Noise, in remaining true to their original futurist ethos of making songs from natural sounds, rather than stealing shamelessly from other people's records, was seen as outdated and refusing stubbornly to move with the times. The classical influences were also dismissed as snobbish. Record Mirror's review, written by Chris Toomey, summed up the mood of the music press. Since Trevor Horn wisely turned his back on them after the first album, the Art of Noise stuck rigidly to making new age music for the Filofax Brigade. Any progression since then has been minimal. The once clever production ideas which made Who's Afraid Of a minor recording landmark have now become time-trodden, and hearing the same sequenced engine noises after 3 years is simply boring. The record also failed to match the chart success of previous albums, only charting at number 55 in the UK and then dropping out of the chart after 2 weeks. To be fair though, I think this may be mostly to do with how China Records promoted the record. The choice of singles was neither as effective nor as comprehensive as previous albums. In fact, there was only one single, the cover of Dragnet, to promote the film reboot it was written for, which didn't necessarily give the greatest impression of the album as a whole. You can imagine people hearing Dragnet as such and then thinking to themselves, I think I'll pass on the main record. This is despite a single edit having been made for Ode to Don Jose. Imagine how great it would have been if that song had been a single. And the less said about the 88 mix of Dragnet, released in February 1988, the better.
The story is Dragnet. My name's Friday. I carry a badge.
Clearly, no sense shown. In No Sense Nonsense did however gain one enthusiastic supporter, Paul Morley, who had by this point jumped ship from ZTT Records. Robert Fripp once said that music sense and business sense are inherently incompatible, and the alliance between Morley's idiosyncratic musical passion and Sinclair and Horn's business thinking had never been an easy one. Having openly belittled his former band's new direction a year earlier, he would later admit the Art of Noise had created, in his words, an ambient masterpiece. That's not to say, however, that the band had completely escaped his criticisms, as the following year the Art of Noise would once again play into his dismissal of them as a happy-fed takeaway novelty pop act, by having a hit collaboration with Tom Jones. Nowadays, Tom Jones is a national treasure, widely regarded as one of the best and most popular singers in the UK, but his major heyday and string of successful singles have been back in the 70s. By the 80s he was seen as yesterday's news, having failed to have a hit single in the UK top 40 since 1977. That started to change in 1987, when A Boy From Nowhere got to number 2, Tom's first top 10 single in 15 years. Tom was starting to piece his pop career back together and appeared on the Jonathan Ross show performing a cover of the Prince song Kiss. The Art of Noise caught the performance, were impressed, and called Tom Jones up to ask if they could work with him on the track. Et voila!
You don't have to be beautiful to turn me on.
Art of Noise's cover of Kiss featuring Tom Jones ended up being the perfect counterbalance to the previous experimental album, and was also perfect for inclusion on the band's first officially endorsed Best Of compilation released on China Records that year. It ended up peaking at number 5 in the charts, selling well internationally, winning trophies at the Brits and MTV Awards, and remains to this day the Art of Noise's highest charting single. The collaboration further helped to make Tom Jones cool and accessible to a younger audience, and also didn't take itself too seriously, cheekily reveling in its own absurdity by quoting numerous Art of Noise songs in incredibly cheesy ways. You may shudder. Had the Art of Noise really become cheap sellouts? I should hate this, as it's just a throwaway chart pop song that's as far removed from all the noise experimentation that defined Art of Noise releases like Into Battle and In No Sense Nonsense. But this would just be petty snobbishness. Kiss is a fun listen, and it's actually far from throwaway. If anything, it was a full circle back to the formation of the band, when Trevor Horn had openly discussed and attempted to remix old Elvis and Tom Jones songs in this way, but back in the early 80s, no one on the management level had any idea what he was on about, and asked why he wanted to remix a song that had already been mixed. There's also a lot of clever stuff happening in the arrangement that only really talented musicians with strong attention to detail such as Ann Dudley and JJ Yanchalik would consider. It may not be apparent on the low quality YouTube video here, but if you listen to a high quality, high bitrate version of the song, there's a lovely use of word painting, with a gated tremolo effect on Tom Jones' voice as he does the twirl. It pans between the left and right channels and sounds very lovely. It's backed up well by some appropriate piano trills from Ann Dudley. Little details like that really boost the track into something that, while it's maybe not your thing or conforming to your musical tastes, you can't argue with its success, be it in terms of quality or in sales. But the success of Kiss couldn't change the reality that both band and audience were growing weary of the Art of Noise's raison d'etre. In fact, with its straightness and lack of sonic samples, the success of Kiss actually proved that sampling had lost the novelty that had resulted in the Art of Noise's initial popularity. For their next album, 1989's Below the Waist, Ann Dudley and JJ Yanchalik sailed even further away into new territory to try and find a new approach. Could the Art of Noise generate a new noise to freshen things up? For a time, the solution seemed to be world music, which was a new burgeoning genre at that time. The band teamed up with a South African unit called Malatini and the Mahatala Queens. Another full circle moment, as the singers had also appeared on that Malcolm McLaren album Duck Rock, which had helped to inspire the Art of Noise at the start of the 80s. 3 songs were completed out of this collaboration: Chain Gang, Spit and Yebo, the latter of which was released as the only single from the resulting album. Elsewhere, however, Dudley and Yanchalik worked on half of the tracks separately, and the divergence between their own influences was really starting to show. A strong example of this is the string orchestra interludes, Promenades 1 and 2, which were typical of Ann Dudley's scoring work. It's unsurprising to learn that she wrote those tracks on her own. JJ Yanchalik's solo tracks, by contrast, incorporated harder arrangements and rock guitars. He was also trying valiantly to wring every last drop he could from the Fairlight, bless him, with one of his tracks back-to-back featuring that stock orchestral stab that by this point had been heard on hundreds of records and had become a cliché. The result makes for an oddly empty and muddled album that I rarely come back to. It's not without its highlights. Catwalk, originally produced as a remix of a French house track featuring vocal contributions from fashion designer Jean-Paul Gaultier of all people, is deliciously funky. Open Air Dan Dare is such a pleasant, gently reassuring track to invite the listener in with, and then Chain Gang successfully manages to combine the world influence from the Mahatala Queens with fragmented industrial rhythms that wouldn't have been out of place on Into Battle. There's also a nice mellowness to the cover of Robinson Crusoe and its offshoot track Island. But with much of the sampling fun and frolics being pushed into the background, this just feels very lightweight and dated. It washes over you without leaving much of an impact. As for the cover of the James Bond theme, yeah, some things only work when played by a full orchestra, and this is one of them. There's some good ideas in there, a nice new section, and they got the bass right, but I can see why the Bond producers passed on this one. Again, it's the same formula as Peter Gunn, cover a well-known theme for a detective or action hero, and again it shows why you should never repeat a gag twice, or thrice in this instance. They did manage to make the final major minor 9 chords sound not cheesy though, so that's something. Below the Waist feels more like an Anne Dudley solo album than an Art of Noise record, and that's not an insult to Dudley or Jan Charlik, but rather a sign that the Art of Noise had run its course, and its musicians were starting to move on to other things. Try as they might, much as they wanted to, as long as the Art of Noise continued, they would never be able to escape the expectations of their past and move on from sampling.
Sampling in the last few years has really got quite a bad name. In a lot of records I hear, it's not really used creatively. It's really tantamount to theft in many ways. And the Art of Noise was expected to make records using sampling, and it wasn't something that we were particularly interested in doing anymore. And we thought rather than flog it endlessly, we'd respectfully call it a day.
Somewhat prophetically, Below the Waist had ended with Finale, a sombre orchestral piece written by Anne Dudley that was a full circle with the early experiments with Z2T back in 1983. Just like the track And What Have You Done With My Body God, also known as Memento, Finale featured a replaying of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, except here it was turned into a call and response. It was also a fine example of the classical scoring and arrangement that Dudley was now more enthusiastic about doing. For all these reasons, it makes for a haunting end to the original Art of Noise story. The Art of Noise suddenly realised familiarity breeds distress. The Art of Noise suddenly realised fear. The Art of Noise suddenly snapped. Exhausted with the increasingly limited concept of the Art of Noise, Anne and JJ, just 2 members of the 5 that had originally been integral to the group, decided to part ways. In 1990, the split was confirmed by Dudley, who told the press, "We were very radical when we started, doing something nobody had done before, but like all new things, it eventually became mainstream, and I began to feel limited by the lineup. The time has come for fresh adventures." These fresh adventures would ultimately lead back to the Art of Noise in very unusual ways. But for now, to all intents and purposes, Art of Noise would sound no more.
Your music bonuses are 3 more tracks by groups or artists noted for sampling and regarded as part of the sampledelia subgenre. Name the artist or group in each case. Firstly, this group.
It's going to be like 90s, 80s. Like New York scene. Like, it's not Talking Heads, but that sort of.
Yeah, I don't. Oh gosh, I really don't know. It's like.
It's not like a.
It sounds like
Michael Jackson sort of beat.
I have no idea.
David Byrne's the after, so it's not going to be Talking Heads, but.
No. I don't
just
know.
say Talking Heads.
Talking Heads.
No, it's Art of Noise, close to the edit.
Noise is golden, silence is a dead giveaway. From 1990 to 1996, Art of Noise generated neither art nor noise. China Records kept the fire burning with a few remix compilations. In 1990, round about the time the band had confirmed their demise to the press, the record company put out Art of Noise The Ambient Collection, which was basically just a load of the smoother tracks from the China era, segued together with a load of random birds on and wishy-washy sea noises. ambient chill-out music at its most cliched. Though the mix was prepared by Dr. Alex Patterson and youth from The Orb is neither here nor there. Still, this compilation is worth checking out for the youth remix Art of Love, which throws a load of Art of Noise songs together into one funky megamix of a track, even if you've heard that drum break sampled in 100 other songs from the time. Then came the FON mixes in 1991, where Art of Noise tracks were spiced up a bit by remixers from the then booming rave scene, including LFO and The Prodigy. Given how these young ravers had grown up with Art of Noise as a strong influence, it at least made more sense than 1996's Drum and Bass collection, whose mixes didn't even try to sound like their originals. Even when doing promotion for these records, the original members of Art of Noise didn't try to pretend that they were that involved or interested in these compilations. Eventually in 1996, JJ Yenchalik would start a new solo project called Art of Silence. He released one self-titled album of Techno by Numbers, but most of this project will remain unreleased until the 2020s. If you're into your late 90s techno, some of it's worth checking out, particularly what would have been the last album he recorded under the Art of Silence name, ... which features a couple of new versions of old Art of Noise songs. It's at least slightly interesting to hear Close to the Edit and Moments in Love reinterpreted in a 90s trip-hop flavour. Meanwhile, in the opposite corner, Trevor Horn and Paul Morley were trying to restart ZTT Records and do it properly this time. In the late 80s, post-Paul Morley, post-Frankie ZTT had some success with 808 State, Seal, Lisa Stansfield and others, but this commercial success was a far cry from their early days, as these new acts lacked quirkiness. They were no longer the cat amongst the pigeons that Frankie or Art of Noise were, nor a genuine alternative to the sanitised mainstream. And of course, the sleeve notes contain no overly long essays about the genesis of stupidity like in the good old days. But by 1997, ZTT was once again an independent label, trying to return to the eccentric essence of its roots. Paul Morley had returned to the label to help out with marketing to this end, and Anne Dudley also reunited with the label, having already buried the hatchet with Trevor Horn in 1990 by helping him on the music for Seal's debut album and other projects in the intervening years. As part of the remit to make ZTT cool and weird again, Trevor Horn wanted to make an album celebrating the work of his favourite composer, Claude Debussy. He had noticed how modern music had been shaped by, and heavily borrowed from, Debussy's writing style. He especially knew this because as one of the top producers in the country, he'd stolen from Debussy himself, most notably when working on Pet Shop Boys' Left to My Own Devices, whose lyrics name-check Debussy. The popular music of the day, particularly techno and chill-out, relied heavily on the seventh chords, dissonance and so-called impressionist ambience that Debussy had popularised. Indeed, a musical profile of Debussy would be an appropriate summary of 20th century music, especially as one was nearing the end of that century at this point, to much fanfare and speculation. The end of what will probably go down in history as the most important century in musical history, the century that saw the introduction of more new genres and recording formats than any other century before or likely since. Well, that needed commemorating somehow, and Debussy was, in Horn's mind, the perfect analogy. And so, Horn, Dudley and Morley set to work, together with another of Horn's frequent collaborators, 10cc guitarist and video director Lol Creme. Initially, they were working as a new project. Although some of the personnel pined for the old days of Art of Noise, the rights to the name sat with JJ Yenchalik, who was at this point preferring to concentrate on Art of Silence. And so the new group would call themselves the Image of a Group. By 1997 they had produced an hour-long album entitled Balance Music for the Eye. For reasons we'll dwell on in a minute, this album remained on the shelf for many years, and ultimately became a first draft for the Art of Noise comeback album that eventually appeared a couple of years later when the rights issues were eventually resolved.
Will you accept some samples of our work?
Balance is presented very much as a piece of high art, split into 3 acts. Each act begins with a brief narration from Paul Morley about Debussy's impact on music, just so everybody's absolutely clear that this is an album about how Debussy changed the world.
Imagine an actor saying the following, saying it with a nice deep voice with perhaps a hint of a French accent. Imagine me saying the following. Honour to whom honour is due. It is not that Claude Debussy lacked honours in his own day. After a slow start, Claude Debussy was recognised as the greatest French composer of his time. But today, he is more than that. He is considered not only the greatest French composer who ever lived, he is considered the revolutionary who set 20th century music on its way.
Then the rest of the album is an odd blend of Debussy covers, where the original material is treated in a variety of different ways. Some tracks take the purest approach of Anne Dudley playing a Debussy piano piece absolutely straight with no deviation. Some tracks sound like they're also Debussy piano pieces played straight, but they sound like a synth pad rather than a piano. And then there's a fair few tracks that take Debussy material and completely rearrange it. The first real bit of music, Dans le style d'une sarabande mais sans rigueur, opens with the first 8 bars from Sarabande pour le piano, but then the rest of the piece is very selective in terms of how it treats that material. Some bits rely on the first 3 chords in an augmented rhythm, there's a middle break that takes a few bars from the middle, etc. Similarly, in the balance across the century, takes little notable hooks from Piano Prelude No. 4, with the opening motif becoming the main hook for a brand new down-tempo trip-hop song. And then there's some random bits of found sound, experimental atmosphere, remixes of material you've already heard, and one track called The Falling Rocket that's basically just cut up Amen break. We're even treated to Paul Morley rapping in hushed tones, because who wouldn't want to hear that? My favourite track is probably the 40-second interlude, Speechless Creatures. You get the idea. This is basically one of those albums that doesn't care if it's too experimental to the point that you're too unenlightened to get it, man. There's definitely some great ideas in there, and even in what would ultimately be an embryonic form, this is a bit more than just a bunch of Debussy remixes. But I can't imagine that had the Image of a group actually put this album out, it would have made much of an impact, even with the reputations of the individuals concerned. It's always difficult from a marketing point of view to get the public aware of new solo projects, especially ones as pseudo-intellectual as this. Whereas an older band name with some residual value and connotations to past triumphs will always be an easier sell. The album was completed. Lol Creme was already hard at work editing some long-form videos, but then Jen Charlek agreed that Horn & Co. could put out music under the more firmly established and commercially viable name Art of Noise, although he and Gary Langan remained absent from the project, seeing it as too strong a deviation from the quirky Fairlight sampling that they felt had defined the band. When the negotiations over the name were settled, Horn, Morley & Co. felt that the album needed refining, so as to better live up to the name and appeal to a wider audience. The first Art of Noise album on ZTT in 15 years ultimately needed to be a grander statement. The band completely overhauled the material again, dropping a lot of the shorter or emptier sketch tracks, and recruiting the late great John Hurt to give the linking narration the much needed sense of grandeur. Opera singer Sally Bradshaw was also rafted into this end, and in order to provide balance and a proper summary of the diversity of music, there would be a collaboration with rapper Rakim to even things out. Outside dance producers such as Way Out West and the Shark Tank were recruited to remix the existing material, so that Art of Noise could then take these remixes and re-remix them, just as they'd done with their own work ever since 1984's Diversions. The whole point in a way was sample-free except internal. We didn't look to the outside world. It was a really conscious decision, especially after last time. It was important not to come back and sound like some cute parody of the old school Art of Noise.
When I snap my fingers, you will be in a different world.
Imagine an actor saying the following.
Imagine me saying the following.
After a few false starts and delays, Art of Noise finally resurfaced with The Seduction of Claude Debussy in summer 1999, perfectly timed as a reappraisal of 20th century music. Perhaps it was in keeping with their classic eccentricity and love of defying expectations that Art of Noise's comeback album after a decade away should be, of all things, a concept album about the life and work of Debussy, structured and staged as though it were a musical or a Pink Floyd album, or, as the band claimed at the time, the soundtrack to a film that wasn't made about the life of Claude Debussy. Perhaps this isn't true Art of Noise, as its patchy origins imply, and as some online fans argue, but perhaps it's a logical progression from the last album Below the Waist, which was equally removed from the original sampling concept of the band. Perhaps the album does follow Risolo's original manifesto, just with Debussy's music being cut up and reconstructed in a new order, rather than natural sounds. The argument often had about whether or not a lounge Debussy tribute album has the right to be seen as a proper Art of Noise album remains unresolved with no common consensus, but don't let this argument distract you from what is an incredibly polished and enjoyable album, and one that deserves to be enjoyed on its own merits. It's beautifully theatrical and satisfyingly liberal in its musical palette. The album could have very easily been like other homages to Debussy, Clair de Lune with a lame-ass club beat dropped on top, but under the surface there's a lot more going on than that. It helps that this album is wonderfully produced thanks to Horn's years of experience. Unfortunately, the album failed to capture the general public's imagination as hoped. In the age of Steps, Britney Spears and S Club 7, critics were bemused by an Art of Noise album that A. sounded nothing like the old Art of Noise, and B. was decorated with liner notes that went on about an apple beside a bottle not being the same as an apple beside a loaf of bread, further raising suspicions that it was all a load of pseudo-intellectual garbage. Morley later dismissed the album in his book Words and Music as not being mind-blown enough, whatever that might mean. Elsewhere, in a 2002 column for The Observer, he contemplated out loud, "Many people admired our hyper-audacity. Many others thought we were a bunch of twats. As a member of the group, I would say that The Seduction of Claude Debussy is a terribly underestimated and lost masterpiece that even now is influencing some of the things the good Dr. Dre is up to. As a critic, I would describe it as decaffeinated coffee table drum and bass. It didn't crack any markets. There is no known marketable genre for an album that features both Rakim and John Hurt, but the market cracked it. The Seduction album barely charted at 150 in the UK and failed to gain any more attention internationally. To make matters worse, lower budgets meant that Morley's plans for extensive remixing and approximately 40,000 million singles were curtailed when lead single, the Rakim collaboration Metaphors, failed to make the UK top 50 and then dropped out of the chart after a fortnight. This meant that, apart from a few promotional white labels for DJs, most of the complimentary remixes wouldn't be heard by the public until they were put up on streaming services in 2022. In my view, these remixes add to the universe surrounding The Seduction of Claude Debussy. The Born Again and Dream On EPs do a solid job of kicking up their source material for the dance floor, but the true highlight of this era that I would recommend the most is the Something Is Missing single. This started out as a Brothers in Rhythm remix of the song Dreaming in Colour, entitled Dreaming Colour Red. Then Morley wrote some lyrics for the new remix, which was then christened Dreaming Colour Green. And then the Art of Noise completely remixed the track and it became Something Is Missing, the reconstruction of a dream. A wonderfully dotty rave song about proliferation of media, overexposure of information, and human imagination being lost in a barrage of media noise. It sounds very noughties on the one hand, but on the other hasn't aged a bit. The message still rings true as ever, and is delivered in a refreshingly eccentric way that truly lives up to the name Art of Noise. It's like Paranoia remixed by Underworld and the KLF with added opera samples. This deserves more love, and it's a shame it missed out on a proper release back in the day. Sadly, what could have been a true rebellion against the times, bombarding the public with releases that could have complemented each other and enhanced the presence and appreciation of the main album itself, wasn't allowed by the music industry landscape of the day. Without the huge budgets needed to realise the imagined multiverse 20 years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the seduction era of The Art of Noise quietly petered out without fanfare. There were a few live gigs, later documented on the DVD Intervision, and the live audio record Reconstructed. These gigs, featuring all the central musicians playing their respective instruments and looking very ordinary, the complete opposite Art of Noise, became an easy target for ridicule thanks to Paul Morley's presence way up at the front, providing narration in lieu of John Hurt, and atrocious dancing. Even Morley himself was embarrassed by how he ended up appearing, in his own words, like Bobby Ball on acid. But come on, it's funny, and in its own unique way, it makes more sense than Kylie going on about doing the locomotion or whatever. In early 2000, Paul Morley and James Bradbury remixed a few choice cuts from the album so heavily that they became new material once again, namely a half-hour dub EP called Reduction. You have to be properly familiar with the original Seduction source material to properly appreciate the process of this one, I think, otherwise it's a bit anonymous. And then that was that. Reduction, itself a collection of remixes, would be the last original new contemporary Art of Noise release to date. The attempt to bring about a ZTT renaissance had failed, and with the record label ultimately deciding to focus on archival releases of its past glories, which was where the easy money was, the individual members of Art of Noise went away to focus on their own individual projects.
So what happens now?
Anne Dudley is still a hugely successful composer and arranger, having worked on countless films and TV shows, such as The Full Monty, Les Miserables and Poldark, while also doing session work with a huge and impressive list of artists. In the noughties alone, she was involved in best-selling albums by Robbie Williams, S Club 7 and Will Young. She's also worked with the Pet Shop Boys, Annie Lennox, George Michael, Pulp. She's been the musical director for comedian Bill Bailey on some of his tours. She's written orchestral pieces, albums of piano pieces. I could go on, but I'll just mention her 2018 album, Anne Dudley Plays the Art of Noise, which is a load of lovely piano-based reimaginings of Art of Noise material. I especially like Opus 5.5. Trevor Horn continues to produce and perform, sometimes new stuff with the likes of Belle and Sebastian and Robbie Williams. Sometimes he pays tribute to his old production works with cover albums. He released a book in 2022 called Adventures in Modern Recording. JJ Jančář, having retired from music in the late 90s, taught ICT in Oxfordshire before retiring in 2013. Gary Langan still produces and engineers and threw himself into the remastering process for the China-era Art of Noise albums. Paul Morley has presented numerous TV shows, appeared as a talking head in music documentaries, written acclaimed books on his family, The North, Joy Division, Tony Wilson, Bob Dylan, David Bowie, and the history of pop music. Musically, after the Reduction remix EP, he would collaborate again with James Banbury as Infant Joy, taking inspiration this time from Eric Satie and not Debussy. Since 2000, the Art of Noise have on occasion put out archival releases. 2006 saw ZTT release a set called And What Have You Done With My Body God? 4 CDs worth of demos and mixes from the Who's Afraid era. There's a lot of repetition and demos on this that will only be of interest to diehards, so definitely don't check this one out first. The physical package is out of print and often sells online for excess of £60. If you're looking for a simple, concise compilation of all the notable singles The Art of Noise put out on both ZTT and China, 2010 saw the release of the double CD Influence. It's also out of print now, but a few used copies are still available at time of recording. It has some nice exclusives for the diehards, but is the best audio summary of all the notable hit songs Art of Noise made. Previous best-ofs tend to be a little biased in their track selection, depending on what record label originally put them out. There's also a best-of CD compilation called Moments in Love, but this is mainly tracks from Influence, just not structured quite as cohesively well. There's also been remastered deluxe editions of all Art of Noise albums, with the exception of Below the Waist. These have all been lovingly compiled by archivist Ian Peel, who's gone to great lengths to recover original master tapes and contemporary demos and bonus tracks. Unfortunately, at time of recording, these special CDs seem to be out of print and increasingly expensive and hard to come by, even on the internet. There's even been a few reunion gigs by Dudley, Jęczalik and Langen to promote the reissues, but it's very much Art of Noise as a nostalgic museum exhibit with no signs of new material in the future, just as their German counterparts Kraftwerk, equally as influential in electronic music, have been frequently touring since the turn of the century, but focusing on the past rather than the present. In recent years, these live gigs have just featured Gary Langen and JJ Jęczalik, though there's something appropriate about that. After all, it was their initial out-of-hour studio experiments that kick-started the whole thing in the first place well over 40 years ago. I saw them while I was a student, beginning to get into their music. They were playing an outdoor festival, Let's Rock Southampton. For legal reasons, they were presented then as the Art of What? I didn't have a ticket, so having made it to the park just as the opening car engine sounds of Close to the Edit were starting to play, I watched from a distance. I have to admit, it was a mixed experience. An Art of Noise gig nowadays is very much a few people huddled over laptops in front of randomised screen projections of the old 80s videos. No mystery or pretension, completely at odds with all the elusive masks and dancers of their first live performances. There's also medleys of the non-Art of Noise material that Gary, JJ and co worked on just before they started the band, Malcolm McLaren, Yes, etc., which, rather than allowing the Art of Noise material to stand for itself and on its own terms, reduces it to a museum exhibit of 80s music, rather than an advert for the Art of Noise, its music and its philosophy. I enjoyed hearing beatbox on a massive PA, but I went away with the impression of a nostalgic museum for an audience of middle-aged people wanting to relive their youth, and revel in the music of the 80s that is of course apparently far better than the mainstream music being produced nowadays. But the Art of Noise, while some of their music has dated, deserves a reappraisal in a modern context, as it's so much more than an example of 80s music. The studio techniques and samplers that Art of Noise helped popularise can still be heard in pop music today. See Phineas's numerous videos on how he made drum beats out of pedestrian crossings, artillery and struck matches for numerous hit singles with his sister Billie Eilish.
I recorded me and Billie standing in a bathroom striking all these matches. Oh, to make the chorus more impactful, I added the sound of an RPG going off. That's ridiculous, but it sounds great.
This is not an isolated example. Nowadays, we take computers and samples for granted in pop music. The Art of Noise helped to popularise and introduce new listeners to electronic music, and they did so with style, humour, and musings from Paul Morley on the relevance of Goethe or Debussy. In particular, his sloganeering and deadpan imagery was reflected by the designers Republic, who also combined art and philosophy to great effect while designing sleeves and albums for numerous artists such as Aphex Twin and Ortega. A lot of people argue the first CTT era of Art of Noise, chapter 1 of this video, was the golden age of the band, and I probably agree. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts, and what made Art of Noise for me, and possibly for other fans, was the juxtaposition of not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 people, each of whom possessed remarkably broad tastes in both classical and popular music, and who were all incredibly passionate about their own very different fields. The Max Martin of his day, who knew how to construct a pop song in such a way that it would grab the listener and become a hit. A pianist who would provide the melodic musical performance and human warmth, a computer programmer who'd get the technology working, a studio engineer who'd get the levels right, and a minister of information who manufactured the brand, the aesthetic, the personality of the band, suggesting lots of multiple, sometimes conflicting theories and ideas as to what the music was about, so that pop met with philosophy in a way that felt innovative and broke down boundaries between two very different worlds. All of these things provide a perfect balance so that there is something for every music listener. Remove one of these people and you lose at least one vital component that made the Art of Noise so complex and original. I think that's why everything after the Moments in Love single, while not without moments of greatness as we've seen and discussed, feels a bit empty or unfinished in comparison to the ZTT recordings. As Morley implied with those first publicity shots of spanners and masks, the Art of Noise is bigger than any one person or faction. It was Horn who brought everyone together, but it was Jęczalik and Langen who wrote the first Art of Noise recordings. Morley and Jęczalik came up with the name together. Dudley helped with the chords and songwriting, keeping everything musical and playing the piano solos, including that at the end of early single Beatbox Diversion 1, which for many was the first indication of something special. And Morley, love him or hate him, and for the record I'm a personal fan, the band would have not been the compelling human experiment that it was without him. Compare the sleeve of, say, Who's Afraid, the first album, to that of the last album before the split, Below the Waist. There's some influence in the photos, which still show very little of the band members, and focuses on a metaphorical representation of them using speakers. But the text is more minimal, less revealing. It's more ordinary. And although they were and continue to be many things, most of which I'd failed to put into words in this video, one thing The Art of Noise could never be is ordinary. If you're still wondering for the best place to start with The Art of Noise, my advice would be the Into Battle single plus either the Daft or Influence compilation. Then listen to all the albums in chronological order and see how far you can get. And for those of you who like seeing top 10 song rankings, my personal list is as follows: Beatbox from Into Battle, Moments in Love from Into Battle, Close to the Edit from Who's Afraid of the Art of Noise, Camilla from Invisible Silence, Ode to Don Jose from In No Sense Nonsense, A Day at the Races from In No Sense Nonsense, Chain Gang from Below the Waist, Finale from Below the Waist, Il Pleut at the Turn of the Century from The Seduction of Claude Debussy, and Dreaming in Colour from The Seduction of Claude Debussy. I'll leave the final words of this video analysis to Paul Morley, who I'll quote from a variety of sources, each of which may as well form their own alternative ending to the narrative. When promoting The Seduction of Claude Debussy in a Billboard interview, Morley said, "The basic idea of The Art of Noise is the same as it always was and always will be. To be different, to manipulate images of themselves, and to manipulate the outside world." When ZTT Records released the Influence Best Of CD in 2010, Morley was asked to sum up the band in the liner notes, and this is how he wanted Art of Noise to be judged 10 years after they stopped making new music for good. Once upon a time, there was a group called Art of Noise. Their sources were electronic, and their methods were secret. Their sources were Claude Debussy, John Cage, Kraftwerk, Chick Corea, Giorgio Moroder, Dada Playfulness, New York Clubbing, Terry Riley, Technology. Their methods were what they were. Their sources were artistic, their methods were scientific. Their sources were scientific, their methods were artistic. They were breaking beats, setting up house, gliding through mental landscapes. They were masked, mechanical, and, funnily enough, made up. Please accept some samples of their work. Be happy or die, they cried, and funnily enough they meant it. Meanwhile, now that it's the future, The Art of Noise is still a group called Art of Noise, still interested in the history and future of ideas. Future forward, they cry, and funnily enough, they mean it. And to end as we began, with the liner notes from Daft, that first Best Of CD released back in 1986. At the end of the play, it's up to you, the listener, the thinker, the master. You only live once, or you don't even live once, or about this brittle art of noise. Lord, forgive them, for they know what they do.
1 for the money, 2 for the show. Come on in, smile, it's ready to go.
Well, thank you very much for watching this video, especially if you made it this far, all the way to the end. At this point in the edit suite, the video is currently 2 hours long. So thank you for making the effort to watch it in full. You may have noticed there's a lot of footage and music that's copyrighted, and all respect due to the original owners. I don't have any plans to monetize this video, as YouTubing is not something I do professionally. It's something I did purely for fun. So this might not be monetized, but if you enjoyed the video and wish to give something back, I don't have a professional Ko-fi or Patreon like other YouTubers. Instead, you're welcome to download some of my own music for a small charge, some of which is inspired by The Art of Noise, and some of which is even inspired by absolutely nothing at all. You can download the music at mcorp.bandcamp.com. podcast@theartofnoise.com. But what would be even more rewarding for me is opening up a discussion. I'd love to chat with you in the videos, in the comments below this video, sorry, I should say. Let me know what your history is with The Art of Noise, why you like them, what your favourite releases are, and feel free to like or subscribe as well.
Don't forget, like I said, it's going to be another beat.